Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm Herel Hughes. Australia and the Netherlands surprised the world in September when both countries sought clarification on a UN resolution, a resolution that supposedly excludes Taiwan's inclusion from the United Nations. That resolution is titled United Nations General Assembly Resolution 2758, which China has been using to say that the world aligns with its One China principle and Taiwan is an integral part of China. Today, to further discuss Taiwan's absence from international organizations and China's role in that, we're joined by Maggie Lewis, a professor at Seton Hall University and a member of Council on Foreign Relations. Maggie, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
So just to begin, we've been referencing this UN Resolution 2758. Can you just tell us, what is it? What happened in 1971 that led to its creation?
Right, and first of all, we're going all the way back to 1971. I mean, this is before even the original Star Wars movie, right? This is it's not new, but I think it's taken on renewed significance because of geopolitical events. And at that point in 1971, it was a very different time where the Republic of China at that point had still maintained a seat in the United Nations. And the People's Republic of China, which at that point was quite young, having just been founded in 1949, did not have a seat. However, the government then under Mao had been pushing to try to get a formal position in the UN, which required getting a large number of votes, that is a vote-based organization, and getting it so that there was a shift in the international view of what should be representing China within the UN.
Now let's take a look at the actual wording of Resolution 2758. The resolution is directly addressing the General Assembly, and we want to focus on these last two paragraphs. Recognizing that the representatives of the government of the People's Republic of China are the only lawful representatives of China to the United Nations, and the People's Republic of China is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, decides to restore all its rights to the People's Republic of China and to recognize the representatives of its government as the only legitimate representatives of China to the United Nations, and to expel forthwith the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek from the place which they unlawfully occupy at the United Nations and in all the organizations related to it. So, Maggie, what does that mean? Is there anything that is standing out to you about the wording?
And the main thing is what's not written on this page, right? You can look all day long at these, 1, 2, 3, 4 short paragraphs. Taiwan isn't mentioned at all. And this is something which I think it's really helpful to go and actually read the document itself, which drives home that this was focused on the government, the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek, taking him out without taking on some deeper and more complicated issues about Republic of China or what is Taiwan and what is its status. There were proposals that there could be a different way of structuring this, where, for example, two-China solution, and that would have and did have some possibilities. Again, they didn't come to fruition, but the drafters were certainly aware, I would expect, of what they put in and what they didn't put in.
So has there been a consensus on the meaning of the resolution moving forward?
I think no, in the sense that what Beijing's view is and what has been pushed out is very different from certainly what the view has been here in Taipei, as well as from many other governments that have looked at this. So even though the wording seems very straightforward, I think this is one of those times where the geopolitics of it make it much more complicated than just what the black and white ink would look like. The point here was they were bound in the sense that that chair or chairs within the UN would now have different people coming to sit with them. But nothing in this resolution says how the countries, once they leave the UN space, how they have to interact with either Taiwan, Taipei, or with the People's Republic of China. But it would make a major shift as far as who was appointing people to show up with UN credentials, from everything from both the General Assembly to, of course, the Security Council, where China has a permanent seat, which is an extremely powerful position in the UN.
As you mentioned, this resolution was passed in 1971. How has China been interpreting it since then?
Yeah, so at this point in 1971, China didn't have much in the way of external relations, right? This was in the time of the Cultural Revolution. China was almost completely closed off. I know from, someone who studied law, that the generations before me, it was really the early 1970s that at least American law professors even started finding any inroads to go into China. So the immediate sort of China putting a message out in the world, that wasn't happening. And even as you got into the 1980s, it was still a fairly constrained outward push of any sort of narrative or external force. So I think one thing that's interesting is that everything old is new again, right? That suddenly, or at least in the last handful of years, this resolution, which has just been there all along, has really come to the forefront. That's new.
Absolutely. Well, what about its use against Taiwan?
And so this is something that I think I really appreciate when people actually go back to the text, right? Because if you just heard the way that the People's Republic of China speaks about this resolution, they've tried to intertwine it with the One China principle. Of course, the One China principle being there's one China, and the government is based in Beijing, and Taiwan is part of that China. I wish in some ways that the One China policies that countries like the US have and others didn't sound so similar to the One China principle, at least in English, because it's radically different. Nothing in here is about the sovereignty of Taiwan. It's not about what any sort of ruling power that Beijing has over Taiwan, but yet that has been very much the narrative that Beijing has been pushing out.
We've seen a number of countries mention Taiwan's exclusion from the UN. Tonga's prime minister even called the United Nations hypocritical for it. And the US, Australia, and the Netherlands have all addressed the resolution directly, even asking for clarification on it. How do you interpret that? Is the tide turning for Taiwan and China?
No, first, nothing needs to be resolved, right? This is just a question of interpreting something that was decided 15 plus years ago, right? So this is action, I think, to push back on a narrative, but it doesn't require any further action in the UN or even in domestic politics. That said, if a country wants to make a clear statement to not only to Beijing, but to countries that might be adhering to or at least interested in getting closer to Beijing's interpretation, then I think a very formal and forceful way to say that is we're not just going to say that in our statements, we're actually going to take the next step to have some sort of formal resolution, whether it's in our parliament or whatever it might be. So this, I think, is just not wanting to lose ground as Beijing is pushing out that what you read here really is the One China principle, when it's not. And the more Beijing says that, the more I think it's needed that there's vigilance to not let just hearing it a lot have that take on some credence.
Now, I want to zoom out a bit on China's growing ability to shape global narrative. So it's not just the UN that we've seen this in. We also see that China has significant control within Interpol, which is the world's largest international police force. So how is China exerting their influence there?
And to have a country that's becoming stronger economically and being able to, being more involved in the world, to exert influence beyond its borders, we can find a gazillion examples of that in history. Like, that alone is not surprising or particularly worrisome. That's what happens. And someone who studies international law and international norms, they change. Like, they are not static. We've had a lot of continuity in sort of the post-World War II international order with respect to human rights and whatnot. But international law is dynamic. It shifts. There's new treaties. There's customary international law. So something like Interpol, it too, it should change to a certain extent with the times. What are the concerns? When Interpol was created, we didn't worry as much about computer crimes, right? So this is something where having influence and that we can expect that, but then how is that influence being asserted? So one thing was interesting with Interpol is that the Interpol meets, they have their big meetings. They did that about 9 years ago in Beijing. Xi Jinping spoke to the Interpol General Assembly, which you don't get any higher recognition of this being an important meeting. And at that when they met in Beijing, the Interpol leadership passed a resolution, and it was about what it takes to have membership in Interpol. And interestingly, one of the main things they highlighted is that you need to have an entity that is recognized, places, and looking at, do you have a seat in the UN as a key point for membership. So never in that Interpol resolution does it specifically mention Taiwan, yet essentially an invisible or not so invisible ink is Taiwan. So that's one way you're seeing, I think, the influence of the PRC and Interpol to make sure Taiwan is not in it. But you also see Interpol being interesting because it is a way to reach out of your borders to try to get back people you have accused of crimes. And Beijing has definitely been more vigorous in using Interpol for that.
So I want to touch on that exactly. Does this mean China is able to enforce its laws on political dissidents who have fled abroad?
Yeah, and again, here's a time that countries do reach outside their borders with criminal law. So that can be a very good thing. We don't want to have a world where someone can commit a crime someplace and then flee to another country and say essentially you can't touch me, equivalent of playing a kid's game where there's a safe zone, right? So, and also there's times that people might plot an attack from outside a country, but the actual harm might occur in a country. So these sort of transnational or reaching, there's a lot of good reasons to do it. Where we get worried is when the reason a country is reaching out is not for what is generally seen as legitimate reasons of getting back someone who's engaged with fraud or human trafficking, but rather what is essentially a way to pull back people who disagree with the government and either using an excuse, accusing them of a crime, or just finding, just basically flat out saying to their friends, we don't need to tell you why, but we want this person back.
Have we seen other states assisting China in this, in going after dissidents abroad?
And it's not just about dissidents. China historically has had huge problems with corruption, still does. It's hard to quantify how much. But a lot of what Beijing has been trying to do is get back people who are accused of being corrupt and fleeing with a lot of money. It's getting harder to get out of China with your money and to get yourself out, but some of this is residual, people that fled 10 years ago, more. And there's an issue of, even if there's very strong evidence that this person engaged in corruption in a way that it's not a political offense, countries also need to ask, are we okay sending this person back to China? What kind of process will they go through? Will there be a fair trial? Will there be a chance? So that's, regardless, even if nothing political's on the table. And I think we see texture. Historically, before Xi Jinping, we certainly had countries that were more willing to engage in legal assistance, both giving evidence or information, as well as sometimes extradition, actually sending people back. There certainly has been increased concern about that. The European Union has had decisions that are essentially saying we are extremely untrusting of what's going to happen with the process. Other countries are faster to get someone on a plane.
And so what can Taiwan do? What can people outside of Beijing do to counter this narrative?
And part of it is countering the narrative, and that's, I love getting back to the text. I'm a professor, being clear about what happened historically and what did not, and making sure that there isn't a reframing that is departing from what history will actually support and the words on paper. So that's the narrative. With respect to actual actions outside their borders, again, this is, I think, where lines need to be drawn and say, we need to recognize that there will be times that countries operate in some way outside their borders, but if you're going to send someone to another country, you're going to let their government know why they're coming and get permission. Sovereignty is important, and those lines need to be respected.
Well, thank you so much for your insights today. I really did learn a lot.
Thanks for having me. Anytime you want to talk law, I'm here for it.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from TaiwanPlus News, follow us on social media. We'll see you next time.